Testing. Okay.
Let's just get this out of your way altogether.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. This is my very first time in Asheville at Malaprop, so I'm super excited to be here because all I ever hear are wonderful, wonderful things about the store and the staff from other authors that I know. So I am really happy to be here, so thank you so much for being here tonight. I am really excited to tell you a little bit about Warcross. This is my latest, and it's very near future science fiction, so I'll talk a little bit about that and how I came to write the story and what I used to do before I became a full-time writer. And then I'll open up to questions from you guys, so please feel free to ask me anything that strikes your interest about anything I talk about, as long as it's not a spoiler question. So if it's a spoiler question, you can totally come ask me afterwards why I killed so-and-so at the end of whichever book. Because there's several. But otherwise, I'm totally open to any other questions. So Warcross is the first in a new duology that I'm writing. It's a 2-book series, and it is set about 10 years from today. So it's very, very near future science fiction. It stars a girl named Amika Chen, who is an 18-year-old bounty hunter living in New York City on her own. She doesn't have any parents, and she's kind of down on her luck. The story opens with her with $13 to her name, and she's got pretty much nothing else. As a bounty hunter, she's kind of a bounty hunter in the Boba Fett sense. She tracks down petty criminals that the police don't have time to catch, and gets paid to do it. But it doesn't pay that well, and she has to compete with other hunters, so it's a hard job for her to do. In this 10-year, from now, future, there is a game called Warcross. Warcross is a game that has taken the world by storm, and everybody plays this game. Everybody's obsessed with it, and it was created by this boy named Hideo Tanaka. He made the game when he was 13 years old, and now, as the story opens, he is 21 years old, so a young man now. And Amika has always looked up to him and admired him for creating this game, and she is also a huge fan of this game. But as the story opens, she is kind of desperate for money. So in desperation, she hacks into the opening ceremony of the International Warcross Championships and glitches herself into the game. Chaos ensues. The next day, she's on every tabloid cover, every newspaper headline, and she gets a phone call from Hideo himself, who's like, hey, I have an offer for you. So at that point, her life just goes completely off the rails. And that's a little bit about the story summary. I would say this is my favorite thing that I've ever written because it has a lot of myself in it. It involves games a lot because before I became a full-time writer, I used to work as a artist in the video game industry. I fell into that industry kind of spontaneously. I thought I was going to be a lawyer when I was studying in college, which clearly did not happen. I don't have the right personality. I think it's better for the world that I'm not a lawyer. And in my senior year of college, I was kind of I had gotten into law school and I was going to go, but my heart just wasn't there. And I remember wandering around campus just feeling very emo, very sorry for myself, what do I do with my life? And I stopped in front of this kiosk that had a bulletin on it. And I stopped because the bulletin said at the top, do you like to play video games? And I had always been a gamer, so I was like, yes, I do love to play video games. And the second line said, do you like to draw? And I had always been, I always loved to draw. I've drawn as long as I have written. And so I was like, oh, I love these two things. And then I kept reading, and the bulletin said, well, this is from Disney Interactive Studios. It's the video game division of the Walt Disney Company. And we are looking for 8 interns to join us for 6 months. And all you're gonna do for 6 months, paid, is to come up with new video game ideas. Like, that was the job description. And I remember standing there thinking, this sounds like the coolest job I have ever heard of in my life. Like, I didn't actually even know that the video game industry was a thing. I didn't know, I mean, I don't know where I thought video games came from, but it just never made that connection. Like, oh right, you know, there's people and companies that make video games. So I got really excited and I ran back to my dorm room and I looked up everything I could about this internship, and then I applied for it and I got in. So I randomly started working in the video game industry, and it was like that first 6 months at Disney was probably some of the best times I ever had working in the corporate world. It was just absolutely phenomenal. I loved the people I was working with. They actually inspired me to write again. At that point, I had been kind of down on my own writing, so this was what gave me the boost to start writing again. And so I credit the industry a lot with that. And I ended up staying in the video game industry for like an extra 5 or 6 years or so until Legend finally sold and I became a full-time writer. So there's a lot of little anecdotes from my time working at Disney that kind of crept into the story. It's not that, you know, Amika joins like a video game studio or anything, but there are, you know, international championships of Warcross happening, and there's professional players, you know, who get paid millions of dollars to play this game. And some of them are, you know, loosely based on people that I worked with and friends that I have in the industry. There's a little anecdote in there about Mario Kart. Like, we had this huge Mario Kart thing when I was working at Disney, where like every day after work at 6 o'clock, you could hear the Nintendo DS's lighting up around the room because we were gonna play Mario Kart. And it became this like really big thing among the interns. We're like, oh my God, it's time to play. You know, we had brackets and like tiers and everything. And we went out and bought like a fake wrestler belt and put like blue shells and green shell stickers on it. And whoever won the last round of the day got to hang the belt over their desk the next day. It was like this huge status symbol thing to get it, and our bosses would come in and challenge us for the belts, and it became this like mythical belt in the company, like, oh my God, the intern's belt. And my friend was like internationally ranked in Mario Kart. He was like number 60 in the world or something. So I got really good at Mario Kart during these 6 months. It was like Mario Kart boot camp. So there's a little bit of that in the story, and if you get to that scene, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. So there's a lot of these fun little moments that I wanted to put into the story. Even my dog makes an appearance for 2 seconds, one of my dogs. There's like one dog that I always Insta-story, and the other one I never do. Because the other one is this Chihuahua who hates everyone and everything. But my other dog that I Insta-story all the time is a Corgi. So there is a Corgi that walks across the page for like 2 seconds. In this book, for no like story plot reason other than that it's my dog. So there's a lot of these little moments in the story that are very me. And Mika is the character that I think I identify with the most out of all the characters that I've created, because she's Chinese American and I'm Chinese American, and you know, she has really colorful hair, and I used to have colorful hair. It's really hard to maintain, so I let it wash out. But open it up to questions now. Feel free to ask me anything about Warcross, as long as it's not a spoiler, or about Legend or the Young Elites, or about the writing process, or video games, or whatever is interesting. Yeah. Any questions? Yeah.
So you're like the master of science fiction. Where do you draw your ideas and inspirations for making these dystopian societies?
Yeah, my inspirations for my dystopian societies. This is gonna be sad to say, but I feel like I'm not writing dystopian anymore. I feel like I'm just writing contemporary fiction these days, because you know it's one of those years. I guess it's the only one of those years. So it feels a little weird to see some of the stuff that I've been writing about, especially in the Legend trilogy, kind of being a little on the nose. So I don't know, like at the time that I was writing Legend, it was the year 2009. and this was when Obama had first been elected. And you started seeing like the political fabric fraying in the country. This was right when like, Gabby Giffords had been shot, and there were congressional offices that had their windows broken and all of this. And I remember at that time feeling that sense of unease, that things just didn't seem quite right. And so I used that political tension that was happening in the country to think about what might happen if I pushed our political party off the cliff and push them to the extreme. And then a couple of weeks later, I was reading an article about climate change, and it had a simulated map of what the world will look like 100 years from now, when all of our freshwater ice has melted and the oceans have risen by 100 meters. And that map struck something in me, because I was looking at the United States, and everything from the tip of Florida up to Virginia to the side of Texas was gone, was underwater. Which is chilling for me to say now with all of the hurricanes and the catastrophes that have been happening the last few weeks. And I remember at the time thinking, what if this was what the US looked like? What would people do? Well, people on the East Coast would probably flee to the West Coast. If there's too many people fleeing to the West Coast, do we build a wall between, the eastern and the western half of the country to keep people out? Like, what would happen? Would the West Coast declare martial law? So all of that kind of stewed together into the dystopian society of legend. The Young Elites was very much based on Renaissance era Italy. So a lot of like the history and the religion and the persecution of people during that time went into the creation of the world of the Young Elites. And I would say Warcross is the least dystopian of all of my books, just because it's so, I just said we're kind of living in dystopia right now, but it was written before the election. So it's the most contemporary and realistic of all of my books, and kind of the most optimistic of all of them, but it was an extrapolation on what would happen if whenever the next wave of technology hits. I'm constantly surprised that it's only been 10 years since the smartphone came out. Like, the iPhone debuted in 2007, and 10 years later, we've got the iPhone 10 being announced, and it has like AR capabilities and more glass. So it's really amazing to think that in 10 years, we've been transformed as a world into a place where I can't go anywhere without my phone. Like, I know exactly where it is at all times, and I'm just itching for it to be in my hand all the time. I don't remember how I found directions, before the smartphone, or what I did at restaurants when my friend got up and went to the bathroom, and I just, what did I do before? I just sat and stared at people, I guess, that's what I did. I don't know how I functioned before this phone, and it was only 10 years ago. So I thought, what would it be like if the next big thing comes? And a part of me thinks it might be augmented reality, virtual reality stuff. We just are I don't think the right device has been invented yet, but once it is, how would that change our lives? What would we use it for? What amazing things would we use it for? And what, uneasy, bad things would we use it for? Because I think technology is just it's a platform, it's not inherently good or evil. It's whatever people do with it, it's just a tool. And with every new invention, we find some way of doing both amazing and awful things with it. I mean, look at social media. Social media is at its best when there's disasters and people just do viral donations or spread the news about a missing puppy or anything like that. Social media is at its best. And then social media is at its worst when, we're spreading fake news and, whatever happened with the election this year. And it's really fascinating to me to see how people react to technology. So that was a huge part of the inspiration for the world of Warcross. Yeah, I'm trying not to say World of Warcraft because I keep saying that, and that is not it. Another question, yeah.
Are you allowed to tell us anything about Batman?
Oh yeah, Batman. Yeah, I'll tell you a little bit about Batman. So I am writing a book called Batman Nightwalker. It's coming out January 2nd, 2018, so pretty soon. And it's a collaboration with DC and Random House. They wanted to make 4 YA novels based on 4 iconic DC superheroes. And Lee Bardugo's wonderful, wonderful Wonder Woman Warbringer, that's a lot of W's in one sentence, just came out, and it is fantastic. I'm very intimidated following Lee in this series, but I absolutely loved her Warbringer novel. So Batman is up next, and then there's Catwoman and Superman that are coming up. So yeah, which is written by Matt De La Pena, which is just perfect. So Batman Nightwalker is about Bruce Wayne as an 18-year-old and about what happens when his trust funds open for the very first time. And he's a sudden billionaire overnight, and he's probably like doubly emo because he's Batman and he's a teenager. So I was joking with my friend Alex London about how we should write like Batman emo poetry from like can you imagine Bruce Wayne's like teenage emo poetry? I just would love that collection. That should be made. Yeah, so it's about emo Bruce Wayne when he's 18 and how he gets himself into trouble and ends up having to do community service at Arkham Asylum, of all places. And once he's there, he meets a new villain, this 18-year-old girl named Madeline Wallace. She's the youngest inmate at Arkham Asylum, and she's incredibly smart, very cunning, and messes with Bruce's mind a lot. It's kind of like Silence of the Lambs, but no eating people. So it's a little bit of that, and I had so much fun making a new villain for the Batman universe. It's just like, I feel like the Batman universe is defined by its villains. So that was definitely the highlight of writing that book. And I had a lot of fun writing it. I hope you liked reading it. Yeah.
When you're writing, do you do a storyboard first, or what's your process?
Yeah, my process when I'm writing, it's kind of all chaos. I'm a pantser writer, and that means I write by the seat of my pants. And that means I don't really like plan out my first drafts. I want to, I always write an outline. I always write an outline, and I never follow it. One of these days, I will get farther than chapter 4, and follow my outline. But today is not that day. Early on, I will tend to draw my characters out on paper before I ever start writing the draft, and that helps me figure out who my characters are and identify with them. I've realized that I actually can't get into their headspace, or I have trouble getting their headspace unless I can see them on paper. Or I am drawing when I'm procrastinating. I have writer's block, so you'll see me uploading art and you're like, oh, she has writer's block right now. So that's a little bit of my process in the beginning. I do tend to write really, really extensive character profiles before I start. So even though I don't really know where the story's going, I will know a lot about the characters. I remember with Legend and with the Young Elites, I knew everything about the characters down to their blood types and their favorite fruits and all this random stuff. And then I will write these little, I call them white room scenes. So I will take a few of the characters that I think will clash, and I'll just throw them into a room and just write dialogue and see what happens between them. And usually they'll start bickering and fighting, and it helps me figure out what their dynamics are. And from there, I'll start building out a actual first draft. Yeah, but it's very haphazard and kind of organic, and every single book is a little bit different in the process. By your hand, yeah.
So it's about questions. So a bunch of my friends say that it's their favorite book ever, and they say that you started writing it when you were 15. Is that true?
First of all, thank you so much. That's a huge compliment. And I mean, it kind of started when I was 15. When I was 15, I wrote this really awful, never got published novel, which I'm really hoping none of you read. And it was a high fantasy, and it did star a character named Day. And he was very similar, but a slightly darker, meaner character than what he ended up being in Legend. In Legend, he's kind of got, he's a pretty good guy. in this original fantasy, he was not as nice, and there was nothing good about this novel except for Day. Like, he was the only character that I really cared about, and I kind of put him on a shelf in my head and just I think he was always waiting for the right story to come along. So really, I think he had the oldest character development out of anyone that I've ever written, because he was in my head for a solid 10 years before the rest of the plot of Legend actually caught up to him. And then once that did, I dropped him into the story, and it just fit like a glove. So yeah, so he waited a really long time. Mm-hmm. So it's like half true. Yes, right here.
How, like, when you're writing two different novels and they're like in different worlds, how do you not get confused with, like, you accidentally write something that was meant for one book, but it was actually supposed to be the other?
Yeah, when I'm working on like two different novels, how do I not get them confused and accidentally write one thing into the other novel? That is a great question, because I didn't have this problem until recently. I hadn't really overlapped like that. You know, I had just been working on the Legend trilogy, and then towards the end of the Legend trilogy, I started coming up with the idea for the young elites, and then I was just working on the young elites. But halfway through the young elites, the book was so dark and so intense for me. It was too dark. I feel like I bit off a little more than I could chew. So to cleanse my palate, I had to write something happier at the end of the day, and that's why I started writing Warcross. And I did notice that every now and then there would be like phrases that would creep in here and there that were very similarly worded. I was like plagiarizing myself. And I would notice that, I'm like, wait, this sounds all like Renaissance-y. What is it doing in the Warcross world? So I would have to go back and correct myself on that. And it always takes me a while to find like the right voice. And especially since there was such a huge difference in voice between the young elites and Warcross, I did have a little period of trouble where I had to adjust all of my thoughts. And it cleared up once I finished the young elites and it was just concentrating solely on Warcross. The problem kind of rears its head more when I was working on Batman, because Batman and Warcross were happening side by side. And that I had to actually split my days. So I could not work on two books in one day. It would just mess with my head. So I would probably spend like 2 days working on Warcross and then stop, and then 2 days working on Batman and then stop, and then kind of go back and forth like that. And even then, there were little things that kind of crept in there that I had to go back and edit out. So hopefully they're not too similar, weirdly similar. Yeah. Yeah.
I know you said that you draw when you have writer's block, but how else do you kind of get out of that? And once you think of a momentum back, how do you keep it going?
It's a great question. I get writer's block all the time. My desk in my house is nicknamed the writer's block. I usually when I have writer's block, it's because my subconscious knows that there's something wrong with my story, but the rest of me doesn't know that. And so I just find myself all of a sudden feeling like, oh my God, I don't want to write this chapter, it's really boring, I'm gonna go clean my house. So whenever that happens, I know that, oh, this is me trying to figure out a plot problem. So usually I will just step away from the writing for a few days. I will go and consume other creative media. Sometimes I'll read. If I'm drafting, I can't read because then it affects the voice. So I will end up watching TV shows or movies or something, or I'll play games, or I'll go take a walk on the beach or something. Just to kind of refill the creative well a little bit and kind of subconsciously to see how other creative people do what they do. And then at some point, usually my subconscious will kick in and realize like, oh, this is the fix for whatever it is that's wrong with my story. And I'll go back. Sometimes it takes a day, sometimes it takes like weeks to get through that. If I'm on deadline and I don't have the luxury of that, I just have to power through. I'll just skip the chapter completely. I'll put brackets like insert important thing here, and then skip to the next scene that I know I can write, and just end up with a really messy first draft that I then have to go back to. But it's hard. Like sometimes every time feels like a miracle, like getting out of writer's block. And I just turned in the first draft of the second Warcross book, and I felt like I would never finish it. I was like, this is the one that's gonna break me, and I'm gonna be exposed as a fraud. So that uneasy feeling never goes away when the writer's block hits. Yeah.
So I have 2 questions. Is that allowed?
Yeah.
The first question I have for you is, which of your books do you think most clearly defines you as a writer? And the second one is, what influences have you had? What writers have influenced you?
Yeah, sure. The first question is, which of my books is the most like my style or my voice, like most me? I would say Warcross is pretty close. I wrote Warcross purely for fun. Like, this was my book where I was like, I am just gonna have fun. There's not gonna be any angst, there's not gonna be, trying to stay in the head of a villain for too long. I had written, 6 pretty dark books up until Warcross, and I was just like, you know what, I need something happy. I need something colorful. I need something that's just for me. So that's kind of the genesis of Warcross. And I think I had the most fun working on the first draft of Warcross than I had of any of my first drafts. I hate writing first drafts. Like, that is my least favorite part of the entire writing process. So it kind of surprised and unsettled me that I was relatively enjoying the first draft process of Warcross. So yeah, I would say that's probably the one that came the most naturally to me. And the second question was, which authors have inspired me the most? When I was a kid, I was 11, I read Brian Jacques' Redwall series, and it absolutely changed my world. Like, that was the first fantasy novel I ever read. I see fellow Redwall fans in the crowd. And like, I remember the day that I went to the library and picked up the first book, because I had seen Madameo sitting in the library shelves every time I walked by, and it was really weird because it had like a mouse with a sword and a cape on it, and I was like, what is this? And finally I was like, this is really annoying me. So I went to the bookstore, or the library, and I got it, and just blew through the rest of the Redwall series. And it opened my eyes to fantasy and science fiction as a whole. So it was my gateway into everything else. And I wrote a ton of Redwall fan fiction. Like, that was some of the first fan fiction I ever wrote. Before that, I wrote like Sonic the Hedgehog fan fiction, which is a different thing. Sonic the Hedgehog fan fiction transitioned to Redwall fan fiction. And so I very much credit Brian Jacques with giving me that early start in fantasy and science fiction. Nowadays, I am constantly inspired by fellow YA authors. I think YA is just full of a wealth of incredible talent and stories, and great people. So I'm a huge fan of Leigh Bardugo's Six of Crows series. Woo, yes. I think she's one of the best writers working in YA today. She just has such a brilliant, natural voice, and she gets better with every single book that she writes. It's unbelievable, because I'm like, I don't know where else you can go, but somehow she finds like a new place to get to. Amy Coughlin and Jay Kristoff write the Illuminae series, which I absolutely adore. It's so different and so unique. I read outside of, whenever I read outside of fantasy and science fiction, it's usually like YA stuff too. So Angie Thomas's The Hate You Give is probably one of my favorite reads of this year. Just searing and sobering, and I can't believe it's her debut. Just beautifully written, and very inspiring. And I have a fellow Penguin author, Stephanie Perkins, who is a local. Hi, Stephanie. And Stephanie has a book called There's Someone in Your House coming out in 2 weeks, I think. And it's horror, and I'm so excited to read that, because I've loved every single one of Stephanie's books before that, Anna and Isla and Lola, and I'm just so excited to see how you handle horror. So I just
like the others plus that.
just like the others plus death. Yes. The best stuff. So I just am constantly inspired by the YA community. It's just a really, really nice place to fall into. So I hope I get to stay in it for a while. Yeah.
Aside from your corgis, do any people that you know find their way into your books?
Yeah, aside from my dogs, do any people that I know make their way into my stories? Yeah, there's bits and pieces of myself in pretty much every character that I've ever created. I don't know what that says about me since I've created characters like Adelina, but she's like angry me on the freeway. That's the Adelina part of my heart where I'm just like, I just want a Godzilla foot to crush the person in front of me. I'm like, I'm sure you have a family and you're very lovely, but right now I want you dead. So that went into Adelina. My husband is a very like funny, wisecracking guy with a heart of gold. So bits of his personality creep into Day and to Maggiano, and so there's like similarities between some of my guy leads that are very much influenced by my husband, and a lot of my fellow intern friends from Disney made their way into Warcross in some disguised form or other to protect their privacy. Vince, who was like the guy who like lost our Mario Kart tournament at this like epically thrown blue shell. So sorry, Vince, exposing your loss. But there's all kinds of little moments in there that are inspired by people that I know. Mm-hmm.
So, after you turn the first draft in, what do you do after that? Do you just sit there and wait?
The question is, after I turn in my first draft, what do I do? Do I sit there and wait? That's kind of what I'm doing right now, because I just turned in my first draft for Warcross 2, so I am just like metaphorically sitting and waiting, aka going on tour, and just kind of waiting for my editor to get back to me on it. She'll get back to me in maybe a couple of months or so with like a really hefty, helpful edit letter. Usually it's just a letter. Sometimes if I'm in deep trouble, I will get a phone call too. Like, hey, let's go over the whole thing. I'm lucky that I have, my editor Jen Besser is incredibly kind and very, very generous. So she talks me through things and makes sure I'm not like, I'm terrible, the book is terrible. And she's like, no, it's okay. Well, it's a great start. We'll, work on it. And then I will do my edits. Usually I will do like 2 or 3 rounds of really heavy edits, basically rewrites. And I would say out of the first draft, like I would keep maybe like a third of it. Like that's about how much actually ends up staying. Yeah, like that much. And I'll go through like a few rounds of really heavy rewrites with my editor. And then we move on to like more detailed character things where she's like, oh, punch up this character a little bit, or we need some more stuff here with the world building. And it just gets more and more and more fine-tuned. The funny thing about edit letters is the shorter the edit letter, the more trouble I'm in. The longer, the better I feel. Because when they're long, it's just an itemized list of really detailed stuff. It's like a whole paragraph saying like, I don't know, we should keep this paragraph. Like, but if it's a short letter, it's something like, I don't know if the last third of this book is working. Like you don't need a lot of words to say that. So when I get a short letter, I know it's like, oh God, like a big edit is coming. But if it's a long letter, then I can be like, oh, okay, I'm in the clear. And
Hopefully you'll get that.
I hope, well, actually, no, I already know this one's not gonna be short because this was the first time that I turned in a first draft and included a second document explaining the first draft for my editor. So I'm like, just so in case you don't understand what's happening, this is what I meant to say. And just so you know, I know this character makes no sense right now. So it was like I had to send like a addendum to the first draft this time. So we'll see how the edits go for that.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you've written a lot of different settings. Which one is your favorite?
Which setting is my favorite? I really, really loved writing the setting for Warcross because it was just so different, and it was just colorful and Tron-like, and I got to like design a game, which was really fun. I mean, I feel like designing a video game that's inside of a novel is kind of like being handed an infinite budget. You know, if you were working at a studio and like you were king and nobody could tell you no, and there were no like tech limitations, and you have like no budget limits, and you just make whatever and it works and it's great. So I had a lot of fun making that. But you know, having said that, I did create a gamified society in the Legend series in Champion that ultimately inspired the world for Warcross. And I had a ton of fun working on the Antarctican Society in Champion. That was my first little brush with making a gamified world. And I was kind of bummed that I didn't get to use more of it in Legends, so I think that kind of led to wanting to write Warcross too. Yeah. Yeah.
For each of your series, what was the original story you had before you wrote the first draft?
Ooh.
Or it was all edited and changed?
Oh, like for each of my stories, what was the very, very early version of it like? Oh, that's an interesting question. Well, Legend was kind of like that really bad novel that I wrote when I was 15 that still starred Day, but otherwise was really awful. That story was basically about two races of people fighting in a fantasy country, and Dave was on one side, and he ends up having to infiltrate the other side. I don't actually remember the plot wholly, but that was more or less what was happening. So it was like a really vague-ish version of Legend, I think. The Young Elites, the very, very first version of Young Elites did not star Adelina, and it was not written from a villain's point of view. It was from the point of view of a very bland Clark Kent type boy who was just very good and very bland. And he had powers, and he found friends with powers, and they all made a society and were happy together. And Adelina was the villain in that version, but she was, you know, we weren't in her head. She was just playing the villain. I wrote 100 pages of that, and I gave it to my agent. And my agent, who is a wonderful, very kind, very generous person, but does not sugarcoat anything for me if she doesn't like what I'm writing, she called me and she said verbatim, "When you gave this to me, did you think that it was good?" Those were her exact words. And I was like, oh my God, I'm gonna go eat some ice cream now. Like, by the way, did you like anything about the book, or should I just toss the whole thing? And Kristen said, well, I really like the villain of this story. I like Adelina a lot, and maybe you should make her the main character. And it was kind of like a half-serious thing that we were talking about, but after I got off the phone, I was like, oh, I think that's what's wrong with the story. Like, I don't actually want to write a hero story. I want to write a villain story. So I flipped the whole thing around, threw away the 100 pages, and then redid it from Adelina's point of view, and then everything fell into place. Yeah. And Warcross was fairly similar. Although the only difference was Amika had a best friend that was also a bounty hunter with her. So there were two characters, and ultimately I decided I should just combine them into one character because the other person just wasn't doing anything.
So is it ever difficult when your agent or your editor makes a suggestion like that, and you really have a hard time going with it? Like, so,
Yeah.
right? How do you work through that? How do you force yourself to?
Yeah, that was probably my hardest moment that I remember, the having to start over the Young Elites. It did help a lot that I had 4 manuscripts before Legend that all got rejected and never made it anywhere. I think I built up a thick skin during that time because I accumulated maybe like 600 rejection letters or something like that. It was a lot. And so after I got published, I felt like, you know, none of the criticism could ever hit me quite as hard as 2 of my books, like almost making it, but not quite, you know, making it to publication. So I try to remind myself of that whenever I have those moments. Thankfully, my editor Jen and I get along really well. Like she and I see eye to eye on like almost everything. and our styles just mesh really well together. So to the point where like now, when I turn in a manuscript to her, I usually know already what she's gonna say. Where I'm like, I'm gonna try to sneak by this thing. I know I was kind of lazy about it, but maybe she won't notice. And she's like, Marie, I think that this character needs some development. And I'm like, damn it, you know? So there's like those little moments where, you know, she knows me too well. Kristen is a little harsher on me, but I've kind of gotten used to that. And I kind of am grateful for it also because I know that when she does call me out on something like that, I just take 24 hours and I step away. I'm like, okay, I'm not gonna write a response. I'm not gonna call her back and be like, you don't know what you're talking about. I'm amazing. Or I'm like, I'm gonna quit writing. And I give myself some time. And usually if I give myself 24 hours, I'm like, okay, yeah, she's right about this. And then I can go through like the motions of it. And it's nice to have someone who's brutally honest, I think, on my team, because when she likes something, I know 100% she means it. Like she really liked the first draft of Warcross, and I remember that day, and I was like, oh my god, this is the greatest day of my life. Kristen likes my story. And I just felt so happy about it. So it's, you know, it giveth and it taketh away.
One of the things I really liked about Emily's was you have the hero of the story basically breaking all the rules that a writer normally has to have for the hero of the story. What was that like just as a writer, you know, knowing you can do anything, and also just as a person, you know, trying to build that story?
Yeah, the question's about Adelina. I had a lot of fun playing with her character for those reasons. And you know, she isn't kind of bound by the burdens of the protagonist. She's not like, I will sacrifice myself for the greater good, because she's like, screw that, I'm gonna go do what I want to do, and how dare these people not listen to me. So it was kind of nice and refreshing to be in the headspace of somebody like that, and it kind of made her unlikable. And I realized one of the challenges is finding that fine line to walk where she's unlikable but still hopefully empathetic to some degree, and people could see all the things that had happened to her, you know, in the past to make her the way that she is, and why she chooses to do what she does. Like, even if like I don't agree with her choices, and mostly I was like, what are you doing? Stop that, that's mean. I still kind of get why she's doing that. And so that was the biggest challenge of writing her, figuring out that line. And as the series went on and she kind of got darker, it became harder and harder and harder to do that. And I actually had to redo the art completely for the third book, which is one of the hardest things I've ever had to write. The Midnight Star nearly killed me. Like, I can't believe I finished that book. But finding the right arc for a villain was not something that I thought through when I started the series. Because you can't really give a happily ever after to a villain, and it doesn't quite feel right. So I was like, what is the arc for a main character villain? So I had to figure out how, you know, what's a redemption arc? You know, how does Darth Vader get redeemed? How does, you know, Magneto and Loki and so on get redeemed? So it was a very different kind of writing exercise to have to put myself through. I don't know if I have the stamina to do that again. Adelina messed with my mind, but I really do love writing about her. Yeah.
Well, going kind of a little bit off of that, I noticed a lot that you seem very interested in like the psychological aspects of your characters, and walking that fine line. I was thinking of, I think it's Thomas in the Legend series.
Yep.
I was just wondering, I mean, can you explain a little bit about like how you do that? Because I'm not really great at writing characters at all, and I'm trying to learn how to get better at that. And so I was just wondering, because I think it's really interesting how you delve into their thoughts, and that they are so human, and they're not like, I'm sure about all of everything that I do all the time. It's like, no, why did this happen? How did this happen? What do you think about it?
Hey, thank you for asking that. I really like exploring the idea that everyone thinks they're the hero of their own story, no matter who it is. And Thomas in Legend absolutely thought he was the hero. Like, he really, really thought he was doing the right thing Adelina thinks that she's doing the right thing. I think like the real world, with the exception of our president, lives in shades of gray. Some people are all evil. Most people are kind of gray. Sorry, I'm feeling punchy today. I think most people are kind of in that gray area, and there's a lot of reasons why people do things the way that they do, or make decisions that they do, and I like to play with that. I think that was kind of formed when I was taking political science in school, and I thought I was going to be a lawyer. I didn't end up becoming a lawyer, but I loved my law classes. They were incredibly interesting because my professors would force us to play devil's advocate. You've got two sides that have to argue, and each side has to sound convincing. So I think that was the first time that I was fascinated by this idea of, everyone on either side of this case thinks that they're right. Like, how can that be? And it's just because we're all really, really different. We're all human, like you said. So I try to take that into building my characters and think not so much in terms of, is this person bad or is this person good? But taking a character and then making another character by flipping all of the aspects of this character, the first character, and seeing how they would clash. If I make one character who believes in one thing, I'm like, okay, now I'm gonna make another character who believes the exact opposite and try to justify what it is that they're doing. And I find those characters to be the most fun to write about in the end. I really did enjoy writing Thomas, and I really enjoyed writing Taryn, who is kind of the real villain of the Young Elites. And he also absolutely thinks that he's right. Like, he thinks he is completely justified in what he's doing. Like, he's a Gryffindor of all things, Like, he truly, truly thinks that he is correct and passionate about what he's doing, where I'm like, you are not okay. But I like playing with that dynamic a lot. Yeah, so it keeps showing up in my books.
Will we ever see Legend on screen?
Will we ever see Legend on screen? I don't know. But Legend, I can't talk a lot about it yet, but I am excited about like a recent development on it. It will get sold to somebody, so the rights are taken now. And I'm excited about the person who's working on it, but we'll see. Hollywood is kind of a tricky thing. So just keep my fingers crossed, and hopefully we'll see something someday. Yeah. I think that's all we have time for. Thank you guys so much again for coming tonight.